first thing that's going to happen, our executive director here at Women's Shelters Canada, Martens, will just give some opening remarks, and she'll pass it off to Evan Sadal, who is the president and CEO of CMHC, to give some words before we get into the presentation of the study. And then we'll do the actual presentation. Chris and several members of the study committee will be presenting the findings and recommendations. And then we'll have the question period. So we will be getting to your questions after the presentation. So just be putting those in the Q&A, and then we'll get to as many of those as we can. So I'm going to pass it over to Lise.
Thanks so much, Leah. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see how many of you have been able to join us today. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I am currently on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I invite each of you to reflect on which territory or treaty land you are joining us from. Today is National Orange Day. It's a day to honor and remember all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis residential school survivors and those who did not make it home. Residential schools continue to impact the lives of so many people. We know that Indigenous women face higher rates of violence than non-Indigenous women. Colonization and racism remain prevalent to this day. The fact that there are more children today in state care than at the height of residential schools is but one indicator of how our systems are severely broken and how Indigenous women and their families continue to face multiple levels of oppression. I'd also like to give my sincere condolences to the family of Joyce Ekakwan, who is the most recent victim of racism within our health system. Finally, I do want to recognize the resilience of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis women who continue to advocate for their culture and people in light of all this adversity. Before moving on to the presentation, I'd like to say a few words about Women's Shelters Canada. We are a national organization that was created in 2012 by the provincial shelter associations. As a pan-Canadian organization, one of our roles is to serve as a connector. We connect the provincial and territorial shelter associations to one another. We connect the 600 shelters and transition houses across the country to one another. And we connect this sector with a number of partners and the federal government. We engage in research, knowledge exchange, and advocacy. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been supporting shelters to the best of our capacity. We have been energized by the commitment of the sector and its creativity in continuing to provide services to women and their children fleeing violence. Our sincere gratitude to all of you who have and continue to contribute to these efforts. The research about to be presented to us today focuses exclusively on second stage shelters. The services provided by second stage shelters, as well as their role in the continuum of services needed for women to rebuild their lives, remains relatively unknown. It is our hope that this study will contribute to changing this. We sincerely thank the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation for the financial support that made this study and its recommendations possible. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to Evan Sadal, President and CEO of CMHC, who will share a few words with us. Evan?
Thank you, Lise. You can hear me all right? Terrific. Yep. Look, it's great to be here today, and I will start by acknowledging that I'm on the traditional unceded territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Métis, and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, which means I'm in North Toronto. And we joke around this house that there are three kinds of problems in the world: problems, first world problems, and North Toronto problems. And that's by way of saying the problems that we have, people who live here, pale in comparison to the real problems that you're addressing in this study. I want to thank Lise, in particular, you, for this invitation to speak. We've met at a few of the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing Symposium, where you've obviously contributed your expertise during our consultations, during our conversations there, as well as our consultations on the National Housing Strategy and on the human rights-based approach to housing. Thank you for your advocacy. I just want to say to the folks on this call that your involvement in all those events. And in particular, the Pan-Canadian Voice for Women's Housing has helped really make it impactful for me. And I hope I can show you what we're doing in my remarks today. Obviously, we're proud that we funded this study. This research is vital in how we shape policies and programs. And we're keen to participate in this discussion today. Obviously, it's important today for a few reasons. It's Orange Shirt Day. I'm wearing my shirt. Whereas Lee said, we honor the victims of residential schools and commit to doing things differently so that Indigenous people, and in particular, Indigenous children, matter. Just returning back to addressing inequities together. You know, we hear a lot about this powerful rallying cry in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic that we're all in this together. The truth is, some people have been harder hit by it than others, and the crisis has deepened existing inequities, particularly those who are vulnerable, particularly women, and particularly those who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color too, but especially Black and Indigenous. That's not news to any of you. You see these inequities in your work every day, those inequities that make women far more vulnerable to the effects of COVID-19 and to domestic violence, as well as all the risks of housing precarity and homelessness. I'd further be remiss in not mentioning the inquiry report into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and to acknowledge that in just a few days on October 4th, vigils will be held across the country to honor the lives of those whose lives were cut short by violence. There are, as you know from the report, 231 calls for action and justice, and some that explain the need for housing, shelters, and transitional housing. Of course, the government is committed to the co-development and implementation of a distinctions-based national action plan. That work's being led by Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada with our support. As for CMHC, we exist for one reason, and that's to make housing affordable for everyone in Canada. We've published a goal that by 2030, our objective is that everyone in Canada, has a home they can afford and that meet their needs. That aspiration feels a little bit more within reach today than it did a week or two ago, notwithstanding the pressures of COVID-19 and the pandemic, by virtue of some of the announcements in the throne speech. The federal government, for example, has committed to eliminating chronic homelessness in Canada, as well as to make substantial housing investments for Canadians through CMHC and otherwise. As we approach the flu season in the winter, and the second wave seems to be developing, there's an urgent need to rapidly create new permanent housing for people experiencing homelessness and living in temporary accommodations. CMHC will be leading this newly announced $1 billion rapid housing initiative that will create up to 3,000 permanent supportive affordable housing units through modular housing, buying into existing lands and buildings that can be converted into housing, and to help people, the vulnerable populations we've talked about, in greatest housing need, including, of course, women and children fleeing violence. We also know there's an urgent need for shelter spaces for Indigenous women, and that was echoed in the Women's Shelters Canada report. So we recently committed, the federal government recently committed to spending $45 million in new funding through CMHC over 5 years to build 12 new shelters, 10 in First Nations communities on reserve and 2 in the territories. I hope we can do more, and we're working on that, but those commitments have indeed been made. These and other measures will help with the urgent housing needs of today, but addressing systematic housing challenges will take much, much longer. How do we create more equitable housing outcomes during this pandemic? And how do we use this pandemic to advance the cause of housing? You know, even as we responded to the COVID-19 crisis, we've worked together to get projects off the ground in communities across the country. This is primarily through the authorities we have under the National Housing Strategy, which commits us to target 1/3 of those investments to the unique and specific needs of women and children. Our National Housing Co-Investment Fund, our flagship fund, had at the end of July committed funds to support close to 800 new shelter spaces and repair over 230 existing spaces. Several projects were for women's housing and or second stage shelters. The YWCA Calgary had 100 units of transitional housing for women and opened its doors almost exactly a year ago, and we're helping them. we're working with provinces and territories on our bilateral housing agreements. They include, they're still new, but have already committed funding through provinces and territories using 50% of the money from us to create close to 350 spaces for women and children fleeing violence as well. I'll flag, but move quickly through the National Housing Strategy Act, where an administrative process will be available for people to recover or to motivate government action by virtue of the actions of a full-time federal housing advocate and a national housing council. And those will include representation of people with lived expertise, a phrase I learned at the Pan-Canadian Women's Voice for Housing, and that's important. Finally, in closing, I want you to know that my colleagues and I are deeply committed to addressing these systematic housing issues facing women and by all who are vulnerable. I will say it's personal for me. I have a job to do, but my own daughter was a victim of partner violence, not by me, or family violence. And our family has lived through the tragedy of her experience. More generally, this past summer, the Black Lives Matter movement has reinvigorated a conversation around CMHC to address systematic housing challenges faced not only by women, but people who are vulnerable, those in particular who are Black and Indigenous. We've made a substantial number of commitments, which I encourage you to read. I published an article on LinkedIn that I retweeted that was entitled "A Movement, Not a Moment," to manifest our absolute determination to address racism, anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous person racism within CMHC, to improve on representation rates, not just among our employee group, but in our leadership group, and to confront these issues in our programs and policies and in the communities we serve. 5 centuries of racism, however, are going to take generations to fix. We need to set ourselves on this path, and CMHC wants to be a leader. I actually spoke just a few hours ago to our minister, Ahmed Hussein, on these very subjects. He's quite committed, and sent him a letter manifesting our commitments to him. We want to influence Canadian society and take real steps to make this happen. So I'll wrap up. We all know there's a huge amount of work to do to help women and children who are vulnerable get through this crisis and to thrive and to feel they belong. And we want to work with you to make this happen. Studies like this, of course, show us a better way forward, and we look forward to hearing from you and keeping the conversation going. I'll just mention in closing that one of the things that I've been doing is reading a book called Me and White Supremacy. It's a workbook over a month on how to be a good ancestor. And I think that's a terrific way, whether you're an ally or an affected individual, to think about these challenges. We have to pass this momentum on to generations and be a good ancestor. And we at CMHC will try to do our part. Thank you for your work. And I will end it there, Lise.
Great. Okay, good. I'm not muted. Sorry, Leah. I have so many screens open. Thank you so much, Evan, for taking the time with us today to share some of your thoughts and reflections on the report and to provide some opening remarks for this event. We really appreciate your time. And I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Chris Mackey. I'm the Research and Policy Manager at Women's Shelters Canada, and I'm really excited to be sharing the results of our Pan-Canadian study on second stage shelters with you today. I'm joined by 5 members of our advisory committee, and I'm just going to pass it over to them to introduce themselves to you as well. And I'll start with Gael.
Hello, my name is Gaëlle Fedida. I am the responsible of the second stage shelter here in Quebec, which is the alliance of l'Alliance des maisons d'hébergement de deuxième étape pour mes enfants victimes de violences conjugales. And I'm also the co-chair of Women's Shelter Canada.
Thank you. Moving on to Michelle.
Hi everyone, my name is Michelle Martens. I'm the Executive Director for Tampanic Status of Women, which is in Kitimat, British Columbia, on the traditional and unceded territory of the Haisla Nation. We operate 6 units of second stage housing here in Kitimat, as well as a variety of other services. And I'll just note I'm sure everybody's heard of the LNG Canada project that has now come into our community, certainly has increased the cost of living in our community. So second stage and affordable housing is more important in our community than ever before.
Thank you, Michelle. Moving on to Cindy.
Hi, my name's Cindy Chason, and I'm the manager of Betty's Haven, which is second stage here in Whitehorse, Yukon, under the Women's Transition Home. And we are on the traditional territory of the Kwanlan Dun First Nation and the Tahang Wichin Council. So thank you for having us today.
Thanks for being here, Cindy. Next, I have Ebony.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ebony. Up until July of this year, I was the executive director of a shelter up in Grand Prairie, Alberta, which is about 4 hours north of Edmonton. So second stage and emergency shelter. And I helped with this project while I was in that role. So I was invited here today to share a few words.
We're so glad you would join us today, even though you've moved on to other things. And we'll close up with Sandy.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sandy Watson-Moyles, and I'm the Executive Director for Three Oaks Foundation. We operate both first and second stage shelter in Belleville, Ontario, and cover the counties of Hastings and Prince Edward. We're a proud member of OACE, which is the Ontario Association of Interval Transition Houses, and this is how I came to be on this committee, taking over for Marlene. One of the things that we recognized at the beginning of COVID was not only how important our second stage housing was, but how easily women who reside in that housing can be missed or forgotten when crises hit. So it became evident that we need to be on the radar and we need to be at the forefront of the work that we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Well, now that you've all heard from us and have a sense of who the research team was, we thought it would be really fun to ask you all to answer a poll about what sector you're joining us from today. So Leah is going to set that up for you. Oh, it should pop up on your screen. Oh, I'll let you go.
Exactly. So I've just launched the poll there. You should see it on your screen. If you don't see it pop up, you can check the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and you might be able to see it there. I see quite a few of you voting. Maybe we'll give it 10 seconds or so for everyone to do that, and then I can share the results. All right, so basically everyone has voted. So I'm going to end the poll there and I'm going to share those results. So hopefully you can all see the results on your screen. And for those who are calling in, I'll just quickly mention there's 29% first stage shelters with us and 34% second stage shelters. So big representation from both groups. We also have people from NGOs, government, academia, the media, and a few others. And if anyone in the other group wants to share what you are, you can do so in the chat. So I'll pass that back to you, Chris.
Great. Thanks, Leah. So we don't have a lot of time with you, so I'm just going to dive right into talking about the results of this pan-Canadian study we did. So for those of you joining us who aren't aware, second stage shelters are transitional supportive housing for survivors of intimate partner violence who are at high risk of danger post-separation and who need additional time and support to transition to a life free from violence. These shelters are a very important part of the continuum of supports for IPV survivors. Second stage shelters are also known as transitional housing, second stage housing, and transitional supportive housing. While I was doing the research, I realized very quickly that there's a lot of different terms we use to describe this type of housing. For this presentation and our report, we just simply use second stage shelters as an umbrella term. And this definition is inclusive of mixed shelters that provide both emergency beds and second stage units at the same location. So this research was overseen by a research advisory committee made up of second stage experts across the country, some of whom you just had the pleasure of meeting today. And this research was grounded in the expertise of those doing this important work at the grassroots level. They reviewed all stages of the study and were instrumental in outreach and identifying potential participating shelters for our on-site visits and interviews. This reflects Women's Shelters Canada's commitment to community-based feminist research that is collaborative and participatory. I'm grateful for all that I've learned with them over this past year. We heard from shelters and interviewees and focus groups, some of you are joining us today, on the importance of this research making an impact. The people we spoke to encouraged our knowledge mobilization to be accessible and engaging, and to take a variety of formats from research presentations, infographics, social media, and workshops. Later today, some of you will be joining us for a second stage shelter workshop to discuss the findings and help us develop our advocacy toolkit. So I'm just going to share my screen, Leah. I just have so many windows open, so it just might take me a second to situate myself here.
So while you're sharing your screen, I'm just going to put a few reminders out there. A reminder to the presenters to speak at a pace that is convenient for the translators, so that everyone can stay with us. And for people who are listening, if you're writing in the chat, you can send your message to all panelists and attendees if you want everyone to see it, rather than just sending it to the panelists. Go ahead, Chris.
Wonderful. Thanks for that reminder, Leah. I get really excited because I'm a nerd when I'm talking about research, so I'll try to slow myself down a little bit for the interpreters. Do you see my screen okay, Leah? Perfect. Okay, so we designed this research using mixed methods to include qualitative and quantitative data gathering to deepen our understanding about second stage shelters. And this research consisted of 4 key areas, including an extensive literature review. And we looked at Canadian and international research from academics and community-based literature. And the literature review really helped provide a foundation for us to develop our survey questions and research questions and identify and address any gaps we could see in the literature. The second component of our study included an online survey. It was offered in both official languages and was live from October to December 2019. And it was open to any organization that provides transitional housing for IPV survivors or a mixed shelter that has second stage units. We collected 97 responses, which is about a 72% response rate, which is quite high. We received responses from every province and territory, except for Nunavut, which of course, unfortunately doesn't have any second stage shelters at this time. Respondents were from mixed regions. We had small regions, rural, as well as urban centers. And there are very few second stage Indigenous shelters in Canada, and only 5 known on reserve, for example. Overall, we had 10 shelters identify as Indigenous, 2 of which were located on a First Nations reserve. So in addition to our survey, we also did on-site visits and interviews, which was, for me, obviously the most fun part of the research project. So we did visits and interviews in 5 regions across the country that were identified early on by our Research Advisory Council. This included British Columbia, Newfoundland and Labrador, the Yukon, Ontario, and Quebec. The sample included major urban centers, medium-sized cities, rural, and 1 shelter located in the north. We interviewed service providers, primarily executive directors, as well as current and former residents of second stage shelters. Engagement with the residents was not limited to a formal interview. I had many informal conversations during my visits, and at one location we held kind of an informal drop-in hours where residents could come and just chat with me about their thoughts about the study, ask me questions, and just share their thoughts about second stage shelters in general, which also helped inform some of my analysis as well. On-site visits helped us have a better idea about the different types of second stage shelters, how they're organized, how they're staffed, the different types of security they offer. And it was also an important opportunity for me to actually see the units, visit with the staff, and meet with residents. I learned a lot in this process and could really feel the sense of home and community in these spaces. And we concluded our data gathering with 2 focus groups that we held in February of this year before the pandemic broke out. And during that time, we brought together 16 second stage shelters to provide an opportunity for them to discuss some of the preliminary findings that we saw coming out of the survey data, as well as the interviews. And we split this group into two groups, one with live interpretation, and findings from those focus groups shaped our analysis and the report. The participants in our focus groups were a diverse group from across Canada. We had participants from rural, small, urban shelters, and 2 Indigenous shelters, 1 urban and 1 from a First Nations reserve. This engagement is an important aspect of feminist participatory action-based research, giving those the most impacted by the research an opportunity to validate or challenge certain findings, engage with the research process, and shape knowledge mobilization activities. We organized a community of practice in conjunction with this focus group to see this foundational work and network we built together continue on long after the research was complete. So now I'm going to pass it over to our advisory committee to share some of the key findings and recommendations. Due to our limited time today, we are unable to share all of our key findings and recommendations, and instead are speaking to some broader themes from the research. And we'll start off with Gael.
And as Gael, you're starting, I'm just going to remind folks that if you are thinking of questions as the presenters are speaking, you can be putting them in the Q&A box at any time, and we will get to them once everyone has spoken. So you don't have to wait till the end to ask your questions. So over to you, Gael.
So a key finding of this study is the importance of breaking the cycle of abuse. Establishing safety and having expertise in IPV are necessary to support survivors during this transition in their lives. Safety is what separates second stage shelter from the other forms of transitional housing and is one of the main goals of this shelter. Safety is crucial in establishing a sense of home and community and in providing a foundation for healing. Many of the survivors we interviewed were high risk for lethality and had fled for their lives. For some, it was the first time that they had ever felt safe. Second stage shelter prevent domestic murder. In Quebec, we estimate the need of 8% of the women out of an emergency shelter. So the survey results show that second stage shelter use a variety of safety measures. 84% held meetings to explain safety rules. 78% have safety cameras. 68% develop security protocols. So these are the most frequently reported as a safety measures. 94% provide safety planning for residents. It is an ongoing and critical aspect of the programming at all stages, from admission to when the lady move into permanent housing. Focus group participants explained how safety is more than just physical safety, and the building and the emotional and psychological safety of residents are also paramount. And here I will quote a resident of a second stage shelter in BC when she shared the fear of she had of her ex-partner and how important it was to have the safety afforded by the shelter. She said, I quote, "Safety was massive for me personally because my former partner will hunt me down. Hence the fact that he found us at the first place. I think that really caused my PTSD. I had massive anxiety and worried about him following us and that he could just turn up anytime. And I've had threats, so I was really nervous about that. I had a protection order, so feeling that there is security in your area, that's really massive. The fact there is double doors in the building is fantastic and every level is locked to what your key fob is." So I'll now pass it over to Michelle.
Great, thank you, Gael. So the finding that I'm going to talk about is time. So service providers and current and former residents of second stage shelters emphasize the importance of having time and space to pause and plan for next steps. This enables survivors to identify and achieve their short and long-term goals, acquire housing, begin the healing process, and live violence-free lives. The ED from NFL shared in an interview, second stage shelters offer us the opportunity to apply a gendered lens and a trauma-informed approach to long-term affordable housing. It gives women a chance to pause for a moment in her own space and decide what is right for her and her children. I think the most helpful aspect of second stage shelters is the return of choice and time to women who have had both of those things taken from them. The most commonly offered programs on site were 86% individual counseling, 70% group counseling, 68% programs for children, and 61% life skills programs. The programs greatly varied, and this list does not encapsulate the full spectrum of programs that are available. Where there were gaps in on-site programs, many had an arrangement with a partnering organization or provided a referral. Additionally, there are a host of services provided on-site to help women navigate various systems. The most reported service was 70% applying for housing, 70% court support, and 62% applying for financial assistance. Building community and a network of support were identified by survivors as critical aspects of their healing journey. Living independently but within a community of women with shared experiences helped women break the silence around abuse, feel less alone, and build new friendships. The groups and programs were an opportunity for women to connect and learn and grow from one another. This was not always easy, and for some it took a while before it felt comfortable opening up. But once they did, it was transformative. And with that, I'll pass it over to Cindy.
Hi. So the recommendation is to increase second stage housing. Currently, there are approximately 124 second stage shelters across Canada. And this does not include the mixed shelters, which Women's Shelters Canada estimates to be about 10. The number of second stage shelters for intimate partner violence must be increased across Canada to prevent violence, abuse, and femicide. Unfortunately, leaving the abuser doesn't always guarantee that the violence will stop. For many, they will continue to be stalked and verbally and emotionally abused by their ex-partner. This is known as post-separation violence, and it is the most serious issue for women fleeing violence today. Research has demonstrated that separation is a significant factor for femicide, and the women are at greater risk for lethal violence within the first several months following their separation. And this is quoted from Dawson. Second stage shelters provide safe and affordable housing with wraparound intimate partner violence support for women and children fleeing violence, thereby reducing the risk of future abuse, trauma, and femicide. Not investing in second stage housing as part of the continuum of support for intimate partner violence survivors could also result in loss of a woman's life. The second recommendation is a number of second stage shelter in rural, remote, and northern communities must be increased. There are limited second stage shelters in these regions due to a critical affordable housing shortage, additional costs to build in the north, fewer opportunities to partner with housing organizations, and barriers to local fundraising. In my shelter, which is located in the Yukon Territory, there is no corporate funding available in the Yukon at all. And I believe in Nunavut is also excluded as there's no second stage shelters there. Only the NWT has access to corporate type funding. And the cost of supplies, when they are available here, is a big challenge for us. With COVID, some of the contractors can't even get plywood. It's all on back order right now. So it's really stopped the housing. And in addition, with that funding proposals, we're kind of limited here because a lot of them say either on reserve, and here in the Yukon, we don't have reserves. So it excludes us from a lot. And yet in the Yukon, we have a high population of Indigenous communities in which we service all of them. So there's 14 First Nation communities, and we support them all within the two homes here. We have 15 units for second stage, so it doesn't go far. Thank you, and at that, I will turn it, oh, sorry, the third recommendation, considering that Indigenous women and girls face higher risk of intimate partner violence and femicide in rural communities and in remote northern areas, alongside with fewer supports, there is a need to increase Indigenous second stage shelters in these particular areas. I thank you, and I will pass it back to Gael.
Thank you, Cindy. I think we'll actually move over to Sandy's findings before we move on to Gael, if that's okay with folks.
Sorry.
No, no worries. No, it's good. So I'll pass it over to Sandy.
Thanks, Chris. Second stage shelters are an integral part of the continuum of supports for women and children fleeing violence. Yet comprehensive and sustainable funding to this life-saving work is a major challenge facing second stage shelters. As indicated, women are most often at risk of being murdered by their partner once they leave. 71% of survey respondents received some form of provincial or territorial funding. However, it was inconsistent and partial funding did not cover the operational budget, for example, staff salaries. Second stage shelters in Newfoundland and Labrador, Newfoundland, Labrador, Saskatchewan, and Ontario did not receive any core funding from their provincial governments. Only 2 provinces, Quebec and Alberta, get recurring funding from their provincial governments. There are only 5 known First Nations second stage shelters in Canada, according to the National Aboriginal Circle Against Family Violence. On-reserve First Nation shelters are at a particular disadvantage as the per diem funding for Indigenous women in emergency shelters does not move to second stage shelter. Additionally, among the Indigenous shelters on and off reserve, only 4 out of the 5 did not receive any government funding. Shelters reported that their government funding covered a range of items. The most frequently reported respondents chose to apply, included 75% salaries, 62% programs, and 49% for maintenance. There is a pressing need for additional funding for legal support workers, additional children's programming, and to support and house the women with precarious immigration status. Funding gaps, meaning that only certain aspects of shelter operations are covered by the funder, were the most reported issue that second stage housing providers face. For example, the funding only covers the upkeep of the building itself, but not the staffing. Or only one specific program or support for another rather than all. This has a spillover effect, leading to the resources being directed to apply for patchwork funding opportunities rather than being focused on survivors. Many shelters have to fundraise to stay open and staffed. As the survey respondent from Saskatchewan shared, we received 0 funding from the provincial government. The only funding we received from the federal government is for summer students funding and the odd grant. Without core operational funding, our entire program is at risk. Saskatchewan is one of the only provinces that does not fund their second stage shelters, and this is a significant challenge for us. I think as a shelter provider and a second stage provider, it's also important to note that violence against women, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, second stage shelters is one of the few transitional programs that's not funded at all, whereas other services that do provide transitional supports to their clientele do receive the funding. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Sandy. We'll pass it over to Gael then to speak to one of our recommendations on funding.
Gael, I think you're on mute.
I'm very sorry. Excuse me. So a sustainable core operational funding for all second stage shelter is required, and also yearly increases in accordance with standard living of costs. And this core recurrent funding must include 3 things. First, maintain the staff with quality staff with competitive salaries. It includes professional development and training opportunities. We need better working conditions and improvement to existing benefits and salaries, medical insurance or pension plan to retain high quality staff. And I'll give you a very striking example in Quebec. So since 2 years, the provincial government is funding the services in second stage shelters. And before this funding, we had an average of 1.3 worker per house for as much as 15 flats to maintain and to host ladies. And since 2 years, our network could recruit more than 50 workers to upgrade services by the money we got from our provincial government. The second core operational funding that it's needed is about the ongoing repairs and building maintenance. There is a dire need to maintain our capacity, and so I welcome Mr. Sadal's explanation that at the beginning of our presentation today. Definitely the National Housing Strategy has programs, but targeting this sector, but the programs themselves and the format are not at all adapted to our reality. And this needs definitely to be adjusted if we want to develop new units. And this is especially pertinent in the context of the global pandemic, because shelters have to reorganize their space to accommodate public health regulations. And thirdly, there is core funding is needed for programming dollars. Second stage shelters are more than bricks and mortar and provide specialized IPV support for survivors. Funding of new second stage shelters should have programming dollars attached to ensure that programming can be delivered consistently. In Quebec, since 2 years, we were able to raise by 30% our capacity to host women and survivors. And then another recommendation is that data from the survey and interviews indicate that there are some key funding areas that should be recognized as core funding in the programming. Funders must financially support the range of services that we provide, and that includes child and youth programs, housing-specific supports, legal education and representation, designated units for women with precarious immigration status, follow-up support for ex-residents, and support for mental health and substance use issues, and trauma-informed practices. So all these are the basic needs of a second stage shelter to be able to provide the services that survivors need. Thank you.
Thank you, Gael. I'll pass it over to Ebony.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to speak to one of the final recommendations around collaboration across sectors. And from the poll, I could see that most of us on the call today or at the event today are from second stage shelters or emergency shelters. And so we all know this piece too well, and I think can all do better to continue to try to work collaboratively together with our government funders, with those doing research, and as well the homeless sector. I really appreciated Evan's remarks at the beginning, and I think some of the pieces that he was able to share with me, those were news to me, and I think really moves us forward in terms of trying to achieve this recommendation, and specifically the calls to justice from the Murdered, Missing, and Indigenous Women and Girls report. So I'm just going to address some of the kind of specific points from the report. And I also want to note, I had an opportunity this morning just to briefly review the full report. I saw that there was a question in the chat box specifically asking about it. And we're flying through this presentation, but the report is really rich and goes into a lot more detail than what we're sharing with you guys today about some of these recommendations. So the yet to be developed National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence and the National Housing Strategy must work together to address these service and support gaps for intimate partner survivors. We've talked about that a little bit already. Of course, we need to recognize and include and adequately fund not only second stage shelters, but also recognize the expertise within the sector and work again collaboratively with funders in order to achieve this. We're also recommending better evaluation tools to improve services and to be able to respond to the need. Finally, in really working together with researchers and including qualitative methods, so similar to what Chris did with this study, interviews and focus groups with survivors, are needed in order to measure these long-term effects of second stage shelters. I saw there was a question as well looking at length of stay. So I think that we can all agree more and more research needs to be done around second stage shelters and their effects. Finally, one of the last pieces I just wanted to mention was that this report in Women's Shelters Canada supports the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network call for a diverse national advisory board that includes the women's homelessness sector and the VAW sector, really to guide and monitor policy responses to COVID-19. Of course, when we were doing this study, the pandemic wasn't in the forefront as much as it is now. And not only that, we're also recommending that the advisory body continues to work collaboratively on policy related to the intersection of violence against women and women's homelessness, even beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. So with that, I think that wraps up this part of the presentation, and I'll move it to Chris to start the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for co-presenting with me today. I appreciate that this is a collective effort because it really was a collective project and so many people had a role to play. So of course, before we jump into our questions, which we're really excited to answer as best as we can, I just wanted to thank everyone who has made this research possible. It can't be done with one person. It's a whole team of people. So of course, the research committee, the people who were here today to co-present with me, thank you so much for being on this journey for the past year. The partnering shelters who coordinated interviews with us and on-site visits, the EDs and survivors who did interviews with us, the focus group participants and survey respondents, and of course the Women's Shelters Canada team. A special thank you to Caitlin, who has spent many hours reading and editing and formatting the report with me. I certainly appreciate the time she's taken to make sure it looks as beautiful and amazing as it is. So with that, I will stop sharing. We did want to let you know that a more comprehensive extended version of these slides with more graphs and charts and interesting things will be available following the presentation. So if you weren't able to, we kept the slides minimal too so that you could actually engage with us in our videos instead of just looking at numbers on a screen. So with that, I will stop the share and open it up for questions.
So I see we have, it's Lise Martin coming back, and I see we have 2 questions. So if we have about 10 minutes, or a bit less than 10 minutes actually, in terms of responding to questions from our presenters. The first question that was asked was whether there was a measurement of the length of stay in second stage housing that resulted in more successful results of the clients. So I invite the panelists. I see Gaëlle would like to have a first response. Sure, Gaëlle.
Well, this was not as such analyzed there, but I can respond for the average length of stay in the 24 houses in Quebec is 8 months and a half. And yes, we see successful results for the clients, especially when we see how and where they can get out of the second stage shelter. And more than 75% of them get a proper housing afterwards, and they are ready to be there alone with their children. So yes, because the fact that they can be able to be in a proper lodging afterwards is really for us a success. And also, of course, the management of their own security.
Thanks, Gaëlle.
Lise, I just wanted to add to that. For this particular survey and study, we didn't ask that question simply because we had just done a survey a year and a half prior that asked the question about length of stay. So I do encourage anyone who hasn't yet read our precursor, which is transitioning to a life free from violence. And in that, the national stats were about 10.5 months for length of stay. And there's a huge section in the report that, and it was very evident in the literature review as well, that time is essential for people to become successful, achieve independence, to heal from trauma, to be able to find housing, to be able to access the social supports they need to actually thrive. So time was a really critical feature, but I think there might have been someone else who wanted to jump in there.
No problem, Sandy.
I just wanted to add that not only with the time piece that's important for the women to have that opportunity to have a breath between most oftentimes escaping to emergency shelter before they're able to transition into safe, affordable housing that's appropriate, are the programs that are attached to the services that we provide that give them opportunity not only to heal and to move forward from their trauma, but to also learn how to live successfully in other environments. That I think some of the findings have spoken to the importance of having those programs and maintaining funding so that the women can not only find housing, but also be successful in maintaining that housing.
Thanks, Sandy. The next question is around the rate of compensation for staff and whether we gathered information in terms of the rate of compensation based on qualifications. And this is someone who is in a shelter, I believe, and currently discussing the issue about the challenges in finding qualified staff, and indeed this is something we've heard from across the country, so I'm not sure if who would like to respond to that. Do you want to start, Chris, in terms of
Sure, yeah, I'd love to. In the visits that I did from the West Coast and the Yukon to Newfoundland and Labrador, I heard over and over again from executive directors how there's a huge turnover in our sector, primarily because the rates and salaries are not enough, and also because of the levels of burnout and vicarious trauma is also a factor, and also that there's also a shortage of workers. And oftentimes, and I heard this in my interviews across the country, these second stage shelters and emergency shelters serve as a training ground, and they learn these amazing skills and they develop their talents, and then they move off into other sectors that are like the health sector that are government paid and have better salaries. So we often have this kind of like shelter worker drain happening, and it's happening all over our country. And again, I'd like to just suggest, because we didn't want to replicate data we had already gathered in that report, the preliminary report before this one, there is a whole section on wages and salaries on page 47 that you're welcome to visit. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can always ask me. Does anyone else from the panel want to jump in? I know you all have some thoughts on this.
I'd just like to say here in the Yukon, obviously we are challenged with this too. We have such a great training program between even second stage and our emergency shelter that we train them and the government takes them. We can't compete with those wages. You know, it's not fair. And then, you know, we get this evaluation that says that they agree our workers aren't paid enough, but they don't want to increase any funding to us either. So
Gail, quickly, and then there's one more question, I think, and then we'll wrap it up.
I might add that we are on the verge in Quebec to obtain something that the government coming back to us on these requests. They offer us to say, okay, standard average wage should be $25 per hour. And they are on the verge to give us that money. So it is possible. This is a message of hope for our colleagues of other provinces. It is possible to get some money and even to get it improved in the years. So themselves, the government, the Ministry of Health told us, okay, we will fix a rate at $25 per hour.
Thanks, Gail.
Lise, just before you jump into the next question, I'm just super quickly going to say, because it's come in a few times and I don't think people can necessarily see the written response, that everyone will be receiving a copy of the full report, a recording of this session, and a copy of a more detailed version of the PowerPoint in the next few days. So I just wanted to say that so everyone had that information. Go ahead, Lise.
Great, thanks. And also the previous report that Chris has been referring to is available on our website, which is endva, va for violence against women.ca. And it's available in both English and French. Just one quick question before we wrap up this Q&A. Well, there are two questions there, but the one is around, are all second stage shelters staffed 24 hours a day, and are some not staffed?
I can start, or Sandy, would you like to go ahead?
I was just going to say that I can only speak from our perspective, and certainly maybe broader to Ontario. We don't have any staff directly attached to second stage housing because we receive no funding for any of our core services nor any of our maintenance. There's no dollars at all attached to second stage housing in the province of Ontario. we are able to provide some extended programs through our emergency shelter funding because the women are considered community-based clients. So they would be able to access those services as if anyone not living at our address could. But as far as specific staffing dedicated to second stage, the answer for us would be no.
Okay, thanks, Sandy. There was a question about how do you open up or start a second stage shelter from someone in the Q&A. That is a big question beyond our time here. I would suggest that you connect with your provincial association as a first step. But this is something that we will be advocating on in the coming year in terms of the transparency of the dollars available at CMHC in terms of how that can help to expand the number of second stage shelters across the country. And I think, you know, just another final piece is that Women's Shelters Canada is advocating strongly for a national action plan on violence against women. And, you know, one of the reasons for this is so clear here, where you have Quebec and Alberta, for example, who have managed to secure, you know, fairly stable funding for second stage shelters. And then you have Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Ontario with no funding for second stage shelters. And I think this study has proven that second stage shelters fulfill an important need across the country. They are our essentially they are our sector's response to transitional housing. So I think in terms of the Q&A, we will leave it there, and we will check the, I know a few questions came in on the chat as well. And if there are questions that haven't been responded to and we'll follow up with you. So I would like to sincerely thank everyone who has joined us today from across the country, as well as the presenters and the interpreters. Special thanks to Chris Mackey, whose research expertise, commitment, and passion have made this study possible. Yay! Also thanks to Caitlin Geiger-Bardswich, our Communications and Development Manager, and Leah Stewart-Shepherd, our Knowledge Exchange Coordinator, who together made this launch and all of the accompanying material a reality. In the next couple of days, we will be sending you a link to this recording, along with links to the report and accompanying material. In the coming year, Women's Shelters Canada will continue to advocate for a greater understanding of the role of second stage shelters and for their expansion across the country. If you have not already done so, we invite you to join us on social media in order to stay in touch. For second stage shelters that signed up for the workshop, a reminder that it starts in 30 minutes, so at 2:30 Eastern Standard Time. A separate link was sent to you by email for this workshop. So I thank you once again for having participated in this launch of our new report, and à la prochaine. Thanks.